On this busy morning, I'm told we are now joined by Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. He is the top Republican on the Senate Intelligence Committee and a member of the Committee on Foreign Relations. Senator, good morning. As I was just describing to my colleagues here, this certainly feels like a big deal over the Black Sea, not far from Ukraine. $30 million piece of American equipment sent to the bottom of the sea. Has the Gang of Eight been briefed? You're part of it. And how should the U.S. respond?
Well, there's been no additional briefings from what's been made available publicly, but I think a couple things are important here. The first is this was a deliberate effort. This wasn't some accident. It wasn't some harassment effort that, went awry. This was a design. They basically decided we are going to begin to shoot down U.S. assets, whatever's flying in what they call restricted airspace. It's over international waters, international airspace, but they declare a restriction over it. For whatever reason, they want to conduct military operations. And they're saying anything that flies in there, we're going to shoot it down. So this is a direct test of the Biden administration. They're trying to see what the limits are, and it's a message of their displeasure. But more importantly, I think it's a test to see if we'll respond to it, if we'll continue to fly, or if this causes us not to fly in that area anymore.
Well, Senator, you're talking about intentional harassment and a decision to shoot down an American aircraft. What should happen? How should the U.S. respond?
I think our response should be to fly more of these in that area and to potentially have them escorted by U.S. fighter jets who are manned and have the capability to respond. These are unarmed platforms. They're generally out there for reconnaissance, to see what's happening in the ocean, to have a situational awareness of what's going on in the area, totally according to international law. And so I think we should fly more of them. We shouldn't stop flying them. And in many cases, we should be prepared to scramble jets and respond if they are threatened by Russian aircraft.
Okay. Of course, the larger context here is the war between Russia and Ukraine. We are backing Ukraine. But recently, Governor DeSantis of Florida, your home state, has said that is a territorial dispute and not directly in the interest of the U.S., that support for Ukraine. What do you make of that?
Well, I think those of us who support some U.S. role in what's happening there have an obligation to explain to people why it matters. Look, Ukraine is not the most important national security issue facing America, but it's not unimportant. There is a vital interest involved here. And one of them is that we haven't just invested money in Ukraine, we've invested our prestige and our credibility. And the argument the Chinese are making is that the West is in terminal decline, the United States is a rapidly declining once great superpower, and they're not going to do anything. They're not going to take on China. So if we were to cut and run now, if we were to walk away from our commitment to Ukraine, the Chinese would point to that and say to our allies, how are you going to count on the United States? They're not going to be there. They abandoned in Afghanistan chaotically, and they didn't do anything about it. They couldn't even sustain an effort in Ukraine against Russia. So I think what we need to do is determine what is it that Ukraine needs, not what they want, but what do they need. Then we need to determine how much of it can we afford to provide. We need to make sure none of it is misspent, and we have to get our allies, particularly rich countries like Germany, to do more and to do their part in that endeavor. But I don't think our interests there are zero, and so our effort there should not be zero either.
Senator, it's Vlad. Let me turn to the economy now and ask you about these recent bank failures, which have resurfaced some criticisms of a law that eased regulations on small banks back in 2018, the Dodd-Frank Reform Act of 2018. You voted in favor of that act. It was bipartisan, we should point out. You had liberals like Barney Frank and Chris Dodd who were in support of it. But was that a mistake?
No. In fact, I think you'll hear today from officials at the federal government and within the Biden administration that law that passed and the provisions therein have nothing to do with why these banks failed. This bank failed for very simple reasons. The way banks make money is they make money on the loans, the interest they make off the loans versus the interest they have to pay depositors. They had a bad balance on their hands, right? They didn't have enough loans with enough interest, and the ones that were locked in at low interest rates, and they were having to pay higher interest rates to their depositors. It's also a very unique bank. It had over 90% of its deposits were uninsured, meaning over $250,000, and they were heavily invested and reliant on a handful of industry startups and tech companies, both of which are going through a tough time right now because of the economy and so forth. So the question we really have here is, are there more banks like this out there? And what are the systemic risks in those banks? But I don't think you're seeing, writ large, the majority of the mid-sized banks, community banks across this country don't look anything like what Silicon Valley Bank looked like. I think the real question is, why did it take the San Francisco Fed and other agencies out there so long to spot this imbalance and this quirky situation of their books at that one bank?
So that is a good question. So what needs to be done so that it doesn't happen again?
Well, I think we need to learn more about how we got here, right? So, for example, over the weekend, it appears over the weekend that there were a number of private buyers, banks that were willing to step in and buy the assets of this bank and absorb it in, and the federal government, federal regulators blocked it. I think that's a very good question. If that really is the ideal outcome here, is for the bank to be bought by someone that absorbs it into a broader portfolio, because the bank does have good deposits and good assets. It's just that their mix in the smaller bank was not good. Why did the government block that? And instead, now potentially every American with a bank account is going to have to pay higher bank fees, because the way you recover these insurance payments that are going to have to go out to guarantee these accounts, the way they're going to pay for that guarantee is they're going to assess all the banks a fee. And those banks are going to pass that through to banking customers. So people that have nothing to do with that bank, that have small deposits, could potentially be paying higher fees as a result of the mismanagement of one bank.
Senator, it's Adriana. You have been on a clock crusade fighting for daylight savings. I wonder, A, how you felt about changing your clocks on Sunday, and B, do you think you can get it done this year after the bill that passed in the Senate died in the House?
And were you rushing to the interview this morning because your microwave clock at home is still an hour behind?
I forgot my belt. That's why I had to go back and get my belt, even though you can't see it right here. But look, here's the thing about it. I don't know why we keep changing times back and forth. We should just pick one and stick with it. The one that we have 8 months out of the year is daylight savings time. I happen to like it because one of the big problems we have in a lot of parts of this country is kids can't do anything after school, because if you don't have a park with lights, then you're out of business by 4:30, 5 o'clock. It's a huge problem. It's a huge issue in many parts of the country. Other people disagree. They like it the other way around. My whole point is, let's stop switching back and forth. Let's stick with one. And if we're going to stick with one, let's stick with the one we already use 8 out of 12 months. And that's daylight savings time. Now, can we pass it? This is Washington. Someone always has a reason to be against something.
Yeah.
But it's not partisan. It's more, I don't even know what you call it. But, the answer is we'll see. I mean, it doesn't look right now like we have the votes to pass it, but we'll keep trying.